This week's laboratory is going to be a look at the brainstem. And so first of all, we are going to look at the ventral brainstem and identify structures, and then we're going to look at the dorsal brainstem and we are going to identify structures. As we look at this model of the brainstem and this ventral view, we begin down here with the identification of the pyramids. And we remember that the pyramids are going to be where the cortical spinal tract is going to be located. Then, lateral to those, we'll see these little bulges here and here. And these are going to be the olives. Now, again, we can identify them as an olive. We can identify them as an inferior olive. Olivary complex, again, I really don't care which one you use. Then we'll see this indentation. And this indentation separates the pyramid from the olive. And that is going to be the pre-olivary sulcus. And then under the olive, and it's a little bit tough to see on this model, but under the olive, right down here, we are going to have the post-olivary sulcus. And then finally, at 90 degrees to those sulci, we are going to see a line that runs right across here. And that line is the pontomedullary junction. And that pontomedullary junction is going to separate the medulla down here from the pons up here. And then finally, as I move cranially, we again see the pons, and then we're going to see these two large areas here and here. And these are the cerebral peduncles. The cerebral peduncles, again, a very, very large raised area. And then kind of in between the peduncles, we're going to see these two little raised areas here. Those are going to be the mammillary bodies. And then in front of that, we see this single midline structure, and that is the infundibulum. Or again, if you like, you may call that the pituitary stalk. So these are the structures that I'm going to be asking you to be able to identify on this ventral view of the brainstem. This is just going to provide you a list of those structures with the same model. But also on the ventral surface of the brainstem, we can see most of the cranial nerves. So if I start from cranial and I move towards caudal, we want to identify the cranial nerves that can be seen. So we're going to see, first of all, the optic nerve. Now, the optic nerve has different parts and pieces. So you can identify this as just the optic nerve, and that's fine. If you want to be more general, you may identify this as the optic system. Then coming out in between, or medial to the cerebral peduncles, we are going to have the ocular motor nerve. Ocular motor nerve is going to be medial to the cerebral peduncles. Then wrapping around lateral to the cerebral peduncles, we can see the trochlear nerve. So we identify the cerebral peduncle, and then we identify the nerves with respect to that peduncle. Then the largest of the cranial nerves comes out of the lateral pons. That will be the trigeminal nerve. And again, we are not concerned with parts and pieces. Then we come back to the pontomedullary junction. And coming out of that pontomedullary junction, we are going to see three cranial nerves. From medial to lateral, we are going to see the abducens nerves. We are going to see the facial nerve. and then we're going to see the vestibulocochlear nerve. So right out of that pontomedullary junction, we can see these three nerves just lining up from medial to lateral. Then, coming from the post olivary sulcus, we are going to see the glossopharyngeal nerve. Next to that, we will see the vagus nerve. And then next to that, the spinal accessory nerve. And then finally, from the pre-olivary sulcus, we can see the hypoglossal nerve. For testing purposes, you may identify the nerve by their name or their number. Again, I don't care which one you use for testing purposes. This is the list of the nerves that you'll want to be able to identify on the ventral surface of the brainstem. Then I want to flip this model over and we want to look at the dorsal surface. This model, you will want to look at this side of the model. You do not need to identify any structures on that side of the model. So as we look at this, we are going to begin again from the caudal standpoint, and we are going to move through the cranial portion of this model. So we begin down again in the caudal section, and we can see, first of all, a raised area right here. And this is going to be the gracile tubercle. And that gracile tubercle, you remember, is where the cell bodies are going to be located. Then right next to that, right here, is the cuneate tubercle. So these two tubercles are right next to each other, and they are going to be that inferior boundary of the fourth ventricle. Then if we go inside the fourth ventricle, so here's going to be our fourth ventricle right here, we identify two raised areas, one here and then one over here. The one more medial and inferior is going to be the hypoglossal trigone. The one more lateral and a little bit more superior is going to be the vagal trigone. These two areas, again, were made up because of a concentration of cell bodies. Then we're going to see fibers that are going to be cutting across right here. Those fibers represent the stria medullaris. And you'll remember those were axons. And so if you were looking at this on a real section, you would see that these would be lighter in color. The model obviously is not going to show that coloring. And then we have a raised area cranial to the stria, and that is going to be the facial colliculus. So within that fourth ventricle, we're going to be able to see the hypoglossal trigone, the vagal trigone, the stria medullaris, and the facial colliculus. Then, if we come above, or again, cranial to the fourth ventricle, we can identify the three cerebellar peduncles. The easiest way to do this is you take the largest peduncle, which is right here, and that is always going to be the middle cerebellar peduncle. Then the one above that here, okay, so all of this, that is going to be the superior cerebellar peduncle. And then the one below down here, That is going to be, let's see, where am I going to write that? The inferior cerebellar peduncle. So again, the easiest way to do the cerebellar peduncles is to take the largest peduncle that you see and identify that as the middle. Then the superior is going to be above that. The inferior is going to be below that. As I move cranially, I'm going to see right here, and then right here, I'm going to see cranial nerve 4, or the trochlear nerve, because we remember that that nerve formed on the dorsal side of the brainstem, exits and then wraps around the lateral aspect of the cerebral peduncle. Then finally, our last two structures, two raised areas, one here and one here. I'll put X's by those dots. Okay. Those are the colliculi. So this one is the inferior colliculus. This one is going to be the superior colliculus. So these are the structures that you need to be able to identify on this dorsal view of the brainstem. Again, do not worry about any of the structures on the other side. We are not doing those for laboratory. So here's our list of the structures that you'll want to be able to identify on the dorsal aspect of the brainstem.